I am California of the past.
I am California of the past.
I
I
am
am California of the past.
Hi, I'm Richard Corville. I live in Alameda, and I first came here as a little boy when I lived in Oakland. My family goes back quite a ways. My mother's father, who was from Sweden, spent his life at sea under canvas and wood and hemp. And around the turn of the century, he ended up in New Zealand, met and married my grandmother, and then they arrived in Oakland around the turn of the century on a steamship named the Alameda, which I think is kind of ironic. My other grandfather arrived here about 1860, and he had immigrated from England to Australia, where he set himself up in a shipping and oyster business with his brothers. He came, I believe, in one of his own ships to California, and he established oyster beds all around the bay. This was at a time when an oyster merchant could stake out state land and harvest oysters. They didn't have to own the land. And at the time when the land didn't have to be yours, he had oyster beds in Alameda. In those early days, oysters were a hot item. The Indians made good use of the native oysters when they were inhabiting the island. There's tons and tons of oyster shells have been recovered that in the early days they used for paving roads. And they're there because the Indians were fond of oysters and they grew naturally here. A lot of the people who had come west from the East Coast had an appetite for good oysters. And California had, at that time, native oysters, which were not the desired oysters that people wanted. So the idea was to plant eastern oysters in the bay, where they more or less thrived. Later on, the state of California decided to sell tidelands to individuals for about $1 an acre. It was all land that was covered by water in the high tide, and then it would be uncovered at low tide. So my grandfather bought a lot of land. He had oyster beds in South San Francisco, where the San Francisco airport is right now, Richardson's Bay by Sausalito, Brooks Island, and Alameda. They were right outside where the Bay Farm Island Bridge is today. If you had oyster beds, they were vulnerable to people going in and swiping them at night or in the fog. So that was one of the downsides. And the author Jack London was one of the oyster pirates. Well, we used to eat oysters a lot. So we kind of kept the tradition going for a while, but it would make the house smell wonderful. I remember Sunday morning breakfast was oysters and biscuits. I remember as a kid when we lived in Oakland, we would drive to Neptune Beach. And I can remember walking out on the beach into the water and feeling the ripples from the waves at low tide. That's my only recollection of Neptune Beach. And I remember going through the tube. That's the one thing I remember. is driving back to Oakland through the tube, all those pretty blue lights. I had my first ice cream cone on the way home one day. We were driving up Webster Street, and there was a creamery on the right-hand side, which I believe is Tilly's restaurant now. And my mother said she went in to get an ice cream cone. She gave me a taste, and she said I grabbed the thing and wouldn't give it back to her. We used to ride our bikes over to Oakland Airport, and at that time there were arcs down near the Aeolian Yacht Club, and we used to like to go down and visit these people, and then go across the bridge and explore Bay Farm Island. And we'd ride all around the island because it was level. In those days there were a bunch of World War I four-stack destroyers that were put aground as kind of a breakwater. And I guess they're all gone now because they've developed Bay Farm Island. Going over to Oakland Airport from Oakland was a pretty good haul. But we used to like to go out to the Oakland Airport because World War II was just over, and there were lots of relics from World War II, fighter planes and parts of airplanes and all sorts of things. When I was a teenager, I joined a group called the Air Scouts, which was the explorer section of the Boy Scouts, and we hung around airplanes and studied aeronautics. The leader of our group was a man named Gordon Fountain, and he was a pilot. And we found out that in 1933 he was with the bird expedition to the South Pole. So I got to be around some interesting people. Through him, I met one of the explorers, Finn Ronnie, and a Dr. Poulter, who were very well known in the bird expedition. That's a little story about early Alameda.